Hey guys, this is Andrew with High Level Reviews, and today I'd like to take a look at Earthbound. The game was developed by Ape, later called Creatures, and published by Nintendo. It was released in North America on June 5, 1995, and was the second title in the Mother series. The game sold poorly in America due to some peculiar advertising techniques, such as ads that openly claimed the game stunk and included a putrid-smelling scratch and sniff snicker, critics that lambasted the simple graphics, and an expensive entry point because of the inclusion of a strategy guide with the game. It was a rough start for an eventual classic that took 5 years to complete and included many notable Japanese figures. From the writer and series director Shigesato Itoi to musician Keiichi Suzuki and future Nintendo president Satoru Iwata. Earthbound, simply put, did things differently and often intentionally highlighted the absurdity and banality of many RPG tropes through parody and satire. Mostly brilliant satire and the occasional crass and goofy one-liner, but did so seamlessly, rarely overburdening the player with information or complex plot structures. Despite an archaic and bare on-screen display, the game was overlooked and rarely credited in the beginning for expanding the genre by implementing the rolling health bar, which gave the player time to take action before a character was knocked out, and enemies that fled when the player's level was too high. It also pushed aside typical RPG fantasy settings for a more modern and stylized take on Western culture, where money is obtained by going to an ATM after the main character's father deposits some, and health-restoring items are pizzas and hamburgers. It is eccentric, idiosyncratic, and despite some serious flaws we'll get into later, a highly intelligent game despite being initially dismissed as a game that looks and feels childish. It was, and I say this in all seriousness, a misunderstood game. Thanks to some feverishly dedicated fan communities, Earthbound slowly received the recognition it deserved, though at times in a frustratingly exaggerated way. And this is the territory we enter with Earthbound. It's either the greatest or the worst, and the shouting matches had between the two factions are unending. The game starts with the main character Snes heading out to investigate a meteorite crash with his neighbor Pokey. Upon reaching the site, they are confronted by an insect from the future named Buzz. It informs them of the universal cosmic destroyer, Gygus, and tells them that he dominates the planet in his world. Buzz senses great latent power in Snes and requests that he seek out melodies, or 8 soundstones, from the world in an attempt to gain the power necessary to defeat Gygus. Snes starts his mission and finds the first soundstone located in a mountain above his hometown. The rest of the game is spent collecting soundstones while slowly adding new party members. The true soul of Earthbound rests in the places you visit and the quirky and often downright mad people Snes interacts with. That and, of course, the numerous parodies and mocking of common RPG practices. It is one of the few games I can recall where I actively tried to talk to as many NPCs as I could. Most of the one-liners are either witty or hilariously gross, sometimes demonstrating self-awareness or simply commenting on how ludicrous a situation is. The structure pushes the player from town to town with no world map, presenting a new, often large, place to explore with its own set of conundrums and zany inhabitants, and just enough time to acculturate oneself. This practice leaves the world feeling connected and cohesive while still showing the player quite distinct locations visually, from the zombie-infested 3 to the Salvador Dali-inspired monster clocks in the backward city of Moonside. Every locale feels unique. The player walks away with the feeling that they experienced a world rather than a set for a TV show with horrible actors. While the story marches along in a playful tone for much of the game, despite dealing with cultists and kidnappers, the dark tones late and the insights into the crew's sacrifices and isolation only deepen the experience, really demonstrating to the player that despite the early tone of the game, the threat was still a very real one. And it seems the parents were all too aware of this, as they rarely attempted to chide the kids or impede their progress. In fact, Snes's parents facilitated his journey by offering save points, money, and his sister provided a delivery service for items. While there certainly could have been more meaningful character development, I still find the focus on the diverse and wild characters and surroundings to be excellent. The numerous Americana references that were skillfully and tactfully implemented also continually won me over. From baseball to the Blues Brothers and the Beatles, there's a little bit of something for everybody here. Item descriptions, weapon names, and hilariously designed monsters with appropriately themed attacks, such as measuring up Snes and his party with a ruler to more accurately attack them. These designs often, yet again, highlight the mundane nature of some prevalent contemporary and sadly modern RPG tropes. It's a surrealist masterpiece in this regard, regularly making the player question what is really happening in the game, especially when it ends. I immediately wanted to replay it after it ended, as the incredible ending only adds to the strangeness of the story, answering many questions while concurrently ushering in many new ones. In this way, Earthbound stands out in a category with only a few others, many of which were directly inspired by it. Where Earthbound unfortunately tends to lose people is its combat, though. While the writing and surreal storytelling keep gamers intrigued and pushing forward, The bare-bones combat system eventually starts to become tedious. That, coupled with long in-combat text sequences and an annoyingly limited storage space for items, are often too much for some to overcome. Though I think Earthbound has received some unnecessarily abrasive and dismissive attacks of its gameplay, I mean, as mentioned earlier, they did some downright innovative things and stayed true to their goal to appeal to a broad audience. It's hard to deny that I too inevitably felt that sense of dreariness after roughly half of the game. There are no random encounters. Monsters are visible on screen and you are able to gain an advantage by sneaking up on them, though that also applies for them. Enemies will also flee from your party if you're simply too high of a level. If you do manage to run into them, the battle is an auto win for you. This simple yet marvelous addition helps the player avoid a lot of otherwise near meaningless encounters, both in experience and potential item drops. To a modern audience, this might not be impressive, but to a generation that grew up experiencing the ceaseless onslaught of backtracking through worthless early game mobs, it was a godsend. It was clear where Itoy and his team's priorities were. They wanted the player to experience the enigmatic journey without dreading the grinding process. Despite there still being some of it, it is a 16-bit RPG after all. Fortunately, most of these grind sessions were early in the game, when difficulty spikes from town to town were felt more because Snes was riding solo for a large chunk of it. Well, sometimes with a trusty teddy bear to absorb hits, of course, which actually was a bit of a necessity given how truly detrimental status effects are in Earthbound. Upon entering an actual fight, the player is immediately struck by the bare-bones interface. It's a first-person view with the menu on screen, and it is reminiscent of games like Dragon Quest. Whether this was an actual homage or laziness or done for accessibility, I am not sure. It's straightforward enough. You have the attack command, Psi, Earthbound's magic, defend, your items, escape, and an auto fight feature. An odd choice, but definitely a unique one that helps cut down on button mashing in an obvious victory. Of course, there is also the rolling health bar, as mentioned earlier. As a player is hit, the health slowly rolls down rather than immediately being cut, giving the player time to rescue the injured player with an item or a heal. Again, a superb mechanic that awards quick thinking. The decision to show much less of combat didn't grate on me initially because the design of the enemies and the quality of the wild backgrounds when combined with said creatures is often an experience hard to explain. In a positive way, it's trippy. These wild psychedelic designs accent even more preposterous enemies, such as a sentient ball of slime that belches at you and alludes to Gygas' plan. Psi abilities are also pretty potent and easy to use throughout the majority of the game. It's also fun to determine what exactly some of the spells do and ensure efficient usage. However, a little over halfway through the game, all of this starts to slowly lose its allure, and the tedium began to set in with no end in sight and no potential in-game moment to reach with my character's combat development. The simplicity of it did work, but perhaps it was just a bit too rudimentary, and perhaps I do need to see character animations to stay invested, even if that is a pretty shallow reason to dislike something. I can't quite pinpoint it. This, coupled with the excruciating task of managing inventory space mid to late game, really tried me. Itoy's explanation of the limited space and the absence of a mechanic allowing the player to stack items made sense. He wanted the player to feel like a kid on an adventure with nothing more than a backpack when decisions needed to be made. He wanted them to be meaningful. While this is a clever excuse, the gameplay implications are often too frustrating to allow time to contemplate this smart explanation. Perhaps Itoy, like in some other areas of the game and like many brilliant people, simply outthought himself. It's an example of a theme or idea hindering gameplay, and that's rarely going to go over well with players. Yes, there are ways to work around it, but even the act of selling is less user-friendly than it should be, and when one considers the amount of items in the game and how poorly the game communicates what is needed and what isn't, it's only more perturbing to decide what to let go of and what to hold on to. Even when the player acquires the use of Escargot Express, that is actually hilariously fast compared to the mock pizza delivery, it doesn't alleviate some of these problems without the player needing to do some research outside of the game. I want to make this abundantly clear. These hindrances and gameplay oversights do not make Earthbound an unplayable title. It's actually pretty smooth in many regards. It's just that these issues are often hard to believe and, more importantly, accept when you juxtapose these faults with other brilliant parts of the game. I suppose the question will be whether or not one is able to look beyond these missteps to see the flawed genius of the game. I certainly was able to, but I can see a gamer that places more emphasis on combat and mechanics having a hard time with this area of the game. The musical influences of both Keiichi Suzuki and Hirokazu Tanaka are incredibly diverse and it takes only a few moments in Earthbound to notice this. Tanaka and Suzuki often cite John Lennon, the Beach Boys, and more specifically Brian Wilson, as particularly inspiring. He played an enormous role in how they developed tracks. Both also mentioned the Beach Boys album Smile as a prime source, claiming that it evoked the dark and bright side of America simultaneously. Tanaka has also gone on record to claim the artist that best represents the spirit of Earthbound would be avant-garde trumpeter Ben Neal, Sun Ra, and Can, among others. With such an eclectic group of musical influences, it's easy to see why each town's selected tracks bestowed a very unique feel that often helped to shape the experience the player had in a town. They just all fit so perfectly. It's also a massive soundtrack, taking up 8 megabits of the 24 megabit cartridge. That's almost 2 CDs worth of music. As with nearly every aspect of this game, whether you love it or despise it, the team's professionalism, deep care, and technical excellence was evident in almost every track. Earthbound probably shouldn't have worked as well as it did, given the myriad gameplay and mechanics issues. The game often elects archaic methods over user-friendly input commands that will assuredly confound and perhaps infuriate a modern gamer not familiar with early RPGs, and even still it might frustrate that demographic as well. But when one starts to actually consider what Earthbound overcame and accomplished, it's an impressive and rare title. From exploring an uncharted modern setting, bouncing gracefully from scatological humor to critiquing American culture and tired RPG conventions, and using an oblique projection rather than the typical isometric perspective of that era. Not to mention how difficult but incredibly admirable it was to culturally translate an outsider's view of the US for an American audience. We can thank Marcus Lindblom for the superb localization and all of the obstacles he conquered to complete the translation. Earthbound did things that simply hadn't been done in video games, and some things that haven't been recreated or even attempted still. These self-reflective works of art are incredibly necessary, even if flawed, to help push creative minds forward, helping people to advance and explore. Many creators in the video game industry, from all genres, often reference Itoy and Earthbound as direct and heavy influences on their works. It's no wonder when one thinks about the passion Itoy had for this project, despite his proclamations that Mother 4 will never happen. Sadly, I found myself, like many others, pushing forward to the next area of the game to see what Itoy and his team had for me. The shortcomings are definitely there, but Earthbound pushes on gracefully, pun after pun, joke after joke, showing players that boring, uninspired writing doesn't and shouldn't be the norm in video games, and especially RPGs. Earthbound, as far as video games are concerned, is the greatest definition of a flawed masterpiece. If you enjoyed the review, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. This has been Andrew with High Level Reviews, and I appreciate you guys stopping by.